Hello everyone, I am Dr. Rita Shukla, and today on the behalf of Collective for Women Philosophers in India, we have Priya Sharma with us. She is about to submit her PhD at IIT Bombay, and she draws a lot from a lot of multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity work which she has been doing. So, Priya, before we dig in deeper, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and most importantly, why philosophy has been one of the subjects on which you have chosen to do your PhD?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Shukla, and thank you for this question because being an interdisciplinary researcher, this question is something which I don't usually get a lot, which I should, because otherwise, it is presumed either I'm working in this area or that area. But I'm very happy that we began with this question, and more so because philosophy happened to me. It happens to all of us all the time. We don't realize, but it happened to me discipline wise or academic, in academic terms, very late in my academic life. It was finally when I joined IIT to do my MPhil that I actually started, interacting with philosophy. So I took the meaning very literal sense, and I started, working with philosophy. So just to give you a little bit of background, I come from a natural science background, so my undergrad was pretty much, was in sciences, and but there I, got introduced to a bit of social anthropology and cultural anthropology because my undergrad was in anthropology honors, but where it was based, it was primarily biological anthropology that we would do along with biochemistry and geology. But even with that one or two subjects of social and cultural anthropology, I knew that this is something that I would want to know more about people per se, would want to go beyond the lab space and make the outside world my lab. Not to say that the other work is any less interesting, but I was more interested in speaking with people directly, and the question of discrimination, which started with the very gendered idea of discrimination, and that's what your collective is also about, to look at the gender gap. So so the gender discrimination, the rural urban gap, because I come from a very small village in Himachal, and I was doing my undergrad in Chandigarh, and slowly, and the caste question, these questions always were in my mind, and I was grappling with them. I didn't have the vocabulary, and that's how I decided, and with the intervention of a very good teacher, and that's how how important teachers are in our lives. So I met that one professor in my undergrad in Punjab University, Chandigarh, who guided me that why don't you go for sociology. So my entry to philosophy has been via social sciences. So I went to Delhi University, did my master's in sociology. Very good 2 years, but still I did not have the conceptual and terminological background to understand a lot of things. But there also, suppose it's like gender, social stratification, where we would read about very day-to-day lives, and what, how we look at our lives, was something which was more interesting to me as opposed to theory. So when I entered IIT, which I entered primarily because that MPhil program, which has now been discontinued under the new NEP program, NEP policy, so that actually looked at policy per se. So that was MPhil in planning and development. And after my master's in sociology, I was working for a year in policy field. So I was with Tata Institute in Bombay, then I was also with TERI in Delhi, and I was working on some projects in the last planning commission project, which just was there before Niti Aayog came in. So I was already working in policy domain. I was already out on the field. I was pretty much equipped with my empirical side of research, but I was still very scared of theory, even after doing 2 years of sociology. And that's when I entered IIT, and I met one professor there, Professor Amrita Banerjee. She was the only one, I guess, that year who had floated a gender-related research topic, and I just grabbed that. That was supposed to be just for one semester, and then we could do with whosoever we would want. But for first semester, it was the academic requirement that you had to go away from your master's discipline and choose something else. That's how I started working with the philosopher. And I told her the first thing was, I don't know theory. I'm very scared of theory. And that's what I think of philosophy. In school, undergrad, I never heard about philosophy. But when we say, no, oh, stop philosophizing, why are you philosophizing so much? So we think about, why are you talking in a lot of abstract terms? So it's like, I'm very much interested in the topic that you have floated, which was around, reproductive technologies. That is what I worked on later. So in 2 years of my MPhil, and then now I'm about to finish my PhD. But my entry was because I was so scared of theory, and I told her I really like the topic that you have floated, but I don't know will I be able to do it, because philosophy has that kind of aura, right? It is very abstract and very, like you
Armchair
talk about
intellectuals, and they're sitting at some
away
ivory
from
tower.
day-to-day experience.
Yeah.
But then my entry into philosophy was through feminist philosophy. And that is based on the very idea of bringing your experience, contextuality in. So the first semester MPhil, when I did it out of, academic, it was mandatory that to do something with someone else. I just never stopped. So I did my entire 4 semesters of MPhil with a philosopher, then even my PhD. So I did keep my empirical roots also there. So I chose, they chose me or I chose them. So I have now one sociology professor and one philosophy professor. So that's like, it was a little bit long answer, but I guess it is maybe whosoever is hearing, if they are also in that changing minds and thinking, okay, now I started with something else, I like something else, how to reach till there, I think this was a great way. And philosophy that way has really helped me to, round myself, to understand, to make sense of the empirical as well. So that's what I guess feminist philosophy did for me.
I mean, I'm glad you took your time and you gave a good background, because there would be lots of students, lots of research scholars like you who are coming from a particular background, who are thinking of making a switch. And in all likely possibility, they are grappling with everyday anxiety, everyday fear, the uncertainty about, okay, I have been trained like this. What do I do if I enter this completely unknown domain, right? So I'm glad, and I hope that everyone who would be watching this video at some point of time, they'll write to you, they'll reach out to you, knowing what is the toolbox which you have used, right, when you were making this transition. So, Priya, before we dig in deeper, I am curious to know about, why don't you tell us about the title of your PhD thesis? And most importantly, what is your PhD all about? And thirdly, how is this amalgamation of sociology and philosophy happening with gender in your PhD thesis?
Yeah, so the first question is something I think all of us, I think you also might have gone through that. The title will keep changing till the very end. So I guess so right now it is something like normative issues around surrogacy policy in India, which was also the title of my MPhil dissertation. So I've taken it from there, but I might add a theoretical analysis with the colon. So there might be some changes, but it is basically around the ethical issues in policy making of surrogacy in India. And what I'm primarily doing in my research is that I think some of you listening to us, and you of course would know that India has recently banned commercial surrogacy. So there was a law there was a bill in the parliament since 2016, which finally, passed in 2021 December, and January this year in 2022 it came into action, which banned anyone from accessing commercial surrogacy, meaning you cannot pay a woman anymore to conceive or to carry a child for you, but it can be done altruistically. So what the government has mandated under the surrogacy regulation bill, that you can still have a child via surrogacy, where essentially, assisted reproductive technologies are involved. So through IVF, an embryo is prepared and is transferred in the womb of a woman who is not going to be the social mother of the child, the actual mother who the society will see as mother. So India at one point was at the peak of India was seen as the mother destination. That's what one sociologist, Shamila Rudrappa, has called India in her work on surrogacy. That India at one point was seen as the mother destination of the world. The US was number one, but US was very expensive. So couples, same-sex couples, singles, heterosexual couples, they were all flocking to India, primarily because we have English-speaking doctors, cheap labor in terms of surrogates and egg donors, but most importantly, because there was no law to oversee it. There were some guidelines which were passed by ICMR in 2005, but they were not legally binding. So still a clinic could make or break their own rules. So there were a lot of reports, a lot of organizations, like there's this organization in Delhi called Sama. It has done tremendous work on pointing out that they do a lot of work in gender and health related issues on clinical trials and reproductive rights, but they've also done a lot of work on surrogacy. Then there is another institute in Delhi only, Center for Social Research. They have also done a lot of empirical work on surrogacy, apart from the academicians. A lot of anthropologists and philosophers that have spoken and discussed about surrogacy, but there were a lot of debates around the ethics of the practice, because these women were primarily coming from lower strata. IVF, surrogacy, ART is very, very expensive. So there is one class of people who are at the receiving end, and there's another class who is providing all the service for a fee. Now the government this bill was in the parliament for a long time, and finally they decided, let's not pay these women and let them do it free of charge. So their idea is that only those women will come now who will not be doing it for money, and this will reduce exploitation. And that's what, in my research, I have critically analyzed. That is this step actually going to work towards their objective, that is to curb exploitation of surrogates? So I went on the field. So that's where my ethical analysis, which I look at the question of ethics in surrogacy through care ethics, which is a feminist ethics lens, and the empirical components, where my anthropological and sociological roots are coming into play. That I actually a lot of philosophers work on the secondary data. So they take the data which is already out. So the people before me who had worked from philosophy discipline on surrogacy were working on the ethnographies which were already published, because there were undoubtedly very good ethnographies. But I was capturing a moment in the time when things were changing.
When the transition was happening.
Yeah, so I thought, why not to go on the field and see for myself? Because when I read the older ethnographies, a lot of times these women, they shy away from calling themselves workers or laborers. They would say that we are just doing it out of the love for our children, which they're actually doing. They want to have money to sustain their own families, but they won't term it as labor what they were doing. But when I went to the field, because I went at this particular moment in history when there was a threat of a ban, they were very vocal about the fact that what we're doing is work, and why on earth somebody wants to stop it. So the question of ethics became very convoluted, and the empirical component, the voices from the field actually enriched the work, what I was doing. But I was also being mindful of the fact that I am on the field at a very particular moment in the history, which really impacts the way even those people who are involved in it look at their own work, which might not have been the case 5 years before, which might not be the case 5 years down the line. So that's where my ethics lens, which I draw entirely from philosophy, and my ethnographic lens, because there was this critique which came from the ethnographic end, from the anthropological and sociological end of the older philosophical literature, which was speaking about surrogacy in broadly right and wrong terms, that either it is entirely right, so reproductive right framework, choice framework, liberal framework, so it was termed as reproductive liberalism, or they were saying that everything is wrong. So there was also a feminist ethicist camp, which is still there. They run a program called Stop Surrogacy Now. It is an international program where they see it as entirely commodification of women's body. This stop. So, anthropologists who are working in Global South, they actually questioned this very black and white kind of picture of ethics, and they said, let's look at the ground. So what I am now trying to do is, I'm working in the tradition of those philosophers who said, okay, we will look at the ground and we'll also maintain our ethical analysis and then see what happens. And for me, the ground comes out of my primary research, along with, of course, I look at other secondary, like the research that has already been there. But I think that's how I've at least attempted to bring the empirical together with the philosophical.
Yeah, and I think something which I was thinking when you were talking about your work, that one of the very prime concerns which most of the feminist movements have had, especially the second feminist movement, was about who controls the body of the woman, right? Who decides what is good for a particular gender. And even recently, if you look at American history, the Roe v. Wade, the reversal and everything which was going on, And it was just regenerating a lot of debates about how are these moral ethical choices now legal choices also, how are they impacting the kind of life woman leads, right? And of
Mm.
course, at the bottom of the this umbrella, when you look at it, there are so many factors which you also mentioned. You talk about social stratification, you talk about caste, class, gender, and also who is at the receiving end. And interestingly, when you made this point that when you went on to field, there were movements saying, why would anyone like to stop it? I mean, we are making, there is certain kind of livelihood attached to it as well, right? So I think it's a very interesting question and theme that you have taken up, and also I think very relevant considering so many changes are happening. So I believe this would also be a shout out to everyone watching this video at some point of time, that if you are working along the similar line, or if you're working in the same field, write to Priya and try to see the kind of work which she has been doing. And I'm sure with each chapter, with every new argument which you were finding, I understand how it must be like a leap of faith which we are taking, especially about something which is changing, and it's changing right in front of your eyes. Right.
And also, as a researcher, you also want to publish. As a young, you want to publish. There are people who stop publishing after getting professorship at times, but as young researchers, we are bound to try to publish. So there would be instances where I have submitted something which has taken 2-3 years, and now the field has changed. So I have to, write to them and tell them that if nothing's happening with that paper, just let me know, because the debate, the discourse has moved forward, and therefore the debate. And like you mentioned that, there might be a lot of people, especially with Roe v. Wade, what has happened. So there, so on the good side, in India, we have, progressive laws in place, but I guess still there is a lot of scope to research, because the question is also accessibility. The question is also the caste angles. There might be laws in place, but how many people have the resources to go and apply in the High Court and the Supreme Court if they are denied abortion? How many are able to do that? I'm happy for the ones who are doing it. They are paving the way for others. But the point is that we are in a much better position, but these questions are still very relevant. And even as you mentioned, second wave and the entire reproductive justice movement that came out of African American feminism, where they were saying that, okay, white street feminism is speaking about reproductive rights and in choice of abortion or contraception, but what about the oppressed communities who are at times forced to be sterilized, which happened in India as well? But I guess those questions, and at times we thought that, okay, have we moved ahead from the abortion debate? But we, right, clearly haven't. And this very idea of the right, and when we say right, it is also about, at the end of the day, justice. We're talking about, what is one's right, or what is the right thing to do. But depending on the structural position, and in India, as you rightly said, caste, along with gender, religion, etc., becomes a very, very important marker to see
Yeah.
that how it's situated.
It's like every day, like so many marriages have happened in our lives with so many concepts. And when you sit back and you try to understand, you actually see that they all are closely related to each other. Like nobody can say that, okay, this is X category of caste and it has nothing to do with Y category of ethnicity or religion or gender. It's just closely related to each other and they impact each other every time, right? So, Priya, now that we are talking on the behalf of Collective for Women Philosophers, and this is one question which is my personal favorite because it helps us locating these budding philosophers, budding social scientists. Uh, I really want to know that when you stumbled upon philosophy, and also you have given us a brief feedback, a brief background about how did it happen. When you were doing philosophy, when you were getting trained in philosophy as a discipline, I want to know that has there been any female philosophers which you have read at some point of time during your coursework, outside your coursework, which impacted you? And have you been able to include them in your PhD work which you are doing? Also, it would be good if you could mention certain gendered voices which you are using in your PhD. if they are contemporary, if they are from 20th, 21st century, as it might give a lot of keywords to a lot of people who are working in the similar field.
Yeah. So I'll begin with something that you preface this question with about, how different concepts marry. I have to commend philosophy. At least in my case, it is only after I got introduced to philosophy and I started, getting trained in it, that I was able to make sense of these concepts. I was able to, formulate that family of vocabulary in my own head. That background was started to, was cemented because of philosophy. Not to say there'll be students who might be coming from literature. There might be students coming from, sociology, in the sense that they might have done it in undergrad or school or whatever, and each discipline has its own strengths and it builds. But I guess philosophy, because it is very much about the presuppositions of each and every field. So each field has a philosophy of that field. So I think that's why it helped me with the conceptual makeup of whatever I did later. I think philosophy has been a great entry point. Once I kind of, got trained, and how I got trained in this. And then, as you asked, that which were the female philosophers that I read. So I think first thing is that I got trained under a female philosopher who unfortunately happens to be the only female professor in philosophy at my department in IIT. So we don't have any other female philosophy faculty, that as much as far as I know. Now when I'm like finishing and not going to department that much, if they have hired someone, I don't know. But for the longest time, for my entire 7 years here, 2 years of MPhil and 5 years of PhD, my own professor, so who was my co-supervisor, was the only female philosopher in the department. And when I started reading, so as I told you that I entered philosophy through feminist philosophy, so the readings also which were assigned, or which I picked up, were more or less, not to say that men don't do feminist philosophy, but for me the entry was through feminist philosophers. So for example, in my MPhil, I remember I started reading, say, my own supervisor Amrita Banerjee's work in surrogacy. So I started with the philosophers who've written about Indian surrogacy. So that would be Amrita Banerjee from IIT, Alison Bailey. I think she's based out of the US. Then there is Jennifer Parks, so again based out of US. So I started with these very contemporary philosophers who were working with surrogacy. So I started with them, and then slowly I kind of traced my footsteps to, okay, then I look at, for example, I was very much interested in the concept of exploitation and the concept of oppression. So I went back to Iris Marion Young, and I started reading her concept of oppression and structural injustice, made sense of what is structural injustice and systemic oppression. What do these terms mean? And she has done wonderful work in justice and its of difference. And through that, so after that, I remember like when I took this one course in my first year of PhD, I was not very much aware, sure of what I'll do. So I had used Iris Marion Young's 5 Faces of Oppression. If those of you are listening, they might know, wonderfully explained. If you don't want to read the entire thing, just read 5 Faces of Oppression by Iris Marion Young. She has wonderful body of work, but that actually will situate your entire idea of, okay, how to look at the structural oppression and move beyond, okay, that one person did this to the other person, but how to kind of understand the entire, how the systems are implicit in reinforcing inequalities and, kind of reinforcing the very oppression. So that was my entry in that sense. So then, like in my PhD, there was this one course that I took out of, like, I had no requirement, like academic requirement to take that course. It was just suggested by by Dr. Amrita Banerjee, who's my co-supervisor. Kushal Dev, Professor Kushal Dev is my sociology supervisor, but my philosophy supervisor, Amrita Banerjee, she actually was taking a course on advanced topics in feminist philosophy. So for me, advanced topics was, I should not have taken it, ideally from a student's perspective. But she said, no, you try it. And I took it as a course, this course subject, So I'll not mention what happened to my CPI after that. Not too bad, but like it was not, okay, I scored 100% there. No, I kind of, I struggled because I would not even understand the question in question paper. Okay, slowly built up. Okay, there are 2 parts of this question paper. That's how you answer in philosophy. But then I was introduced Through to a lot of other classic care ethicists. So Joan Tronto, who's a political scientist but has done a lot of work in care ethics. Sarah Ruddick, who was a philosopher and has done wonderful work in talking about maternal thinking. The idea of she actually takes this dichotomy of reason and emotion heads on. She says that I love reason, but the kind of reason I want to reason for is coming out of the practice, and it's not disinterested reason. So that really, so Sarah Reddick's work and Joan Tronto's work. So Joan Tronto's both Moral Boundaries, which is 1993, I guess, 1993 book, and her latest book, Caring Democracy in 2013. That both the work by Joan Tronto, where she's actually for grounding that the necessity of care and the foundational characteristic of care in our life, and then speaking from there, speaking about how a democratic society could be, what a just caring society could be. So that really helped. Then Sarah Ruddick, as I said, was one of the first philosophers to kind of cement what care ethics was supposed to be, and she talked about the maternal practice giving rise to a kind of rationality. So how the caring practice, which we think at times in the mainstream world, that okay, it's related to only emotion and household private sphere, which has nothing to do with how we reason about things. So there's always this, okay, do we use our head or do we use our heart? That kind of dichotomy. She has brilliantly worked out the fact that through practice we develop certain rationalities. So, and she takes mothering that as that practice and caring as that practice. So Sarah Ruddick's work of maternal thinking was very, very foundational. And these are the two works, actually, more so Tronto's work, because Tronto is also there now with us, and she's also still writing. So more Tronto's work, but Sarah Ruddick's work also was very important in in the kind of work I've done. But I have kept that, because once you start with some concept and you that's how you research, you keep going ahead. So that Eva Kitte's work, Love's Labor, brilliant work around the question of, okay, who do we see as full rational being? And so she actually has a daughter who has cerebral palsy, and her entire work has been around that experience of caring for a dependent, and the work around the fact that how dependency is our truth. We are born and we are dependent as infants. We can be ill and we can be dependent. All of us will grow old and will be dependent. So she has given a very nice argument around dependency and justice, taking on roles in position. So she's the one that I have kind of read. I've not used her that much, so I've used mostly Ruddick in Tronto, but I've been reading, and then there are other very contemporary care ethicists. So I'm primarily in that field of feminist ethics and their care ethics. I do read a few feminist, liberal feminists also, like Asha Bhandari, who are talking about care but they're staying in liberal feminist framework, but talking about care there. So that is the space I am in right now. But I'm sure I will kind of, as I move ahead, I'll also expand my horizons of philosophy and other philosophers. Then, of course, people like Bell Hooks has been very, very inspirational and foundational. Chanda Talpade Mohanty, in her work on third world, like Feminism Without Borders, is something which all of us should read. So, that kind of, especially if you think that you're doing feminist research, you need to give, pay heed to these voices. And then you go back to our very own Professor Kanchana Mahadevan, who's at who's at Mumbai University. I was reading her book. I think, I had that here somewhere. But I was reading her book on care, which has come in 2014, where she has given wonderful. She takes us to Pandita Ramabai from our own India's history, So I guess now I'm more capable of making sense of how the women's movement has been, with Gail Omid's work, how the caste movement has been, and that has all emanated, at least in my case, from entering into philosophy. I think I've become a better, I don't know if it is going to be, I don't know how it's going to sound, but I think I've become a better researcher, better anthropologist, better sociologist, because I entered into philosophy. So I think that has worked in my favor.
And I think actually I'm glad that you mentioned these names. And if we closely look at it, these are just not white feminists. These are also women doing feminist philosophy or using feminism as a toolbox in the Indian domain as well. And of course, Dr. Kanchana is the name when we are talking about philosophy and gendered philosophy in the Indian domain. But Priya, there's something which you said something very interesting, and I would want to know your position on it. When we were talking about your PhD, you said that Dr. Amrita was at that point of time, till that point of time, was the only female uh,
I think
philosophy.
now
Now
I'm not
also,
very sure.
like
Our,
so
yeah,
far, yeah, so far the record goes,
yes,
the only female faculty, philosophy faculty, the only female philosopher in IIT Bombay. And also, you're working on ethics of care. So I want to know from you, in the late 21st century, even though one of the purpose behind forming this collective was to understand gender gap in the Indian philosophical domain. But as someone who is about to submit her PhD, who would be entering the big ocean very soon, do you think we need these tags of female philosopher or woman philosopher? Because okay, I am a woman and I am a philosopher, and I can't change either about it. And we don't use these tags when we talk about some big shots male philosophers, because every time when we talk about philosophy, it has always been a stereotypical rationalizing male whose voice comes into our head, right? That okay, it has to be, they have to look in a certain way. And that's why when myself and Mansi interviewed Dr. Meera, she actually she described in a very beautiful manner that there are stereotypes in students' head about how does a philosopher looks like. So when you enter a class, when a man enters a class and when a woman enters a class, there is a zameen asman ka difference about how students perceive you. Like, are you serious enough to be called a philosopher? Right? Sometimes you would not be taken seriously enough because the kind of mascara you're wearing or the kind of lipstick you're wearing or whatever it is. But do we, so keeping all these in mind, do we need to subscribe to these taglines about male philosopher, woman philosopher, female faculty, male faculty? And I'm also curious to understand, because you have worked on the field, you have worked in different kinds of organizations as well. So, how do you perceive it?
I think it's a great question. And in an ideal world, there should be no tags attached, right? One is a philosopher will be a philosopher, right? And one who's coming from certain caste location would still be that anthropologist, philosopher, economist in whatever position and whatever field, right? In whichever field. In an ideal world, there should be no need to have these tags. But unfortunately, I have not reached that utopia yet. And I'm not sure even if we'll reach in the coming, in philosophy, we talk in centuries. So I'm not sure where will we be, because we are in a very, like, philosophy is in centuries. So, right? This is a very small time in which feminist philosophy has also happened. So I think as of now, I think we need to kind of emphasize these things when we are talking about, because and I'm speaking from my own, what I said just a while back. I mentioned that my philosophy supervisor was the only female philosophy supervisor, and that fact actually that didn't hit me initially, because I did not know philosophy. I did not know the discourse of philosophy, how philosophy is perceived as a rational male field. I knew abstract, but I did not attach abstract to the male at that point in time. I did not have that idea of how discourses are around these things. But slowly, while I was, reading more and understanding more, and that's when it kind of hit me that there would be some reason that there are that initially maybe there were very few female philosophers, or they were there but we were not reading about them. Same goes with anthropology. There were a lot of women who would go with their husbands and do the main part on the field. But when ethnography will be written, either it will not be written, like their names would be erased altogether, or it would be that, okay, ex anthropologist and his wife. And at times they will not even write that his wife was also there, but that wife might have done a very important work on the field to speak to the women, children, understand how the things were going on, because that's what.
So, Priya, you were talking about the necessity, or whether do we even need to have this bifurcation about women philosophers, male philosophers, female faculty members. So, if quickly you could give some remarks on this.
Yeah, so I think, in an ideal world, as I was saying, we shouldn't be needing all these stats. A philosopher would be a philosopher, a doctor is a doctor. You are what wherever your position is, and there should be no tags on the basis of your gender, sexual orientation, caste, religion. But I think we don't live in an ideal world, and especially because we're talking about philosophy here. Philosophy has been a very male dominated field, and let's face that it has been like that, right? So the entire practice of philosophy, entire practice of philosophizing, or about generating knowledge or analyzing things, that capability was at one point, it was a presumption that it only rests with certain people, and those people were gendered people. So it only rests with, say, men, propertied men, men from upper caste, upper class, a certain race, men who are from certain race, heterosexual men. So, and it is the truth. It has been like that, and there would be women who would be doing work at that point. Also, there would be people from the lower strata who would be doing work, even in earlier times, but whose work gets documented, whose work gets that space in your academic discourse and curriculum or your popular discourse, that you know about that work. I think for that reason, even I think we still need to point out, highlight these things. As I said, that in my department, my philosophy supervisor is the only female faculty. At least she was the only female faculty for many years. Because now I'm leaving, I don't know if they've hired someone else, but that is the truth. But on this, somebody can say, who might be in Mumbai University, that almost everyone is a female in Mumbai University's philosophy department. So it's not like I'm giving just example from IIT because I am from there. But in general, I'm saying, because I've spoken to a lot of students, even in your classes, you might, if the students who have done philosophy in undergrad, at times they are not even taught a lot of feminist philosophers. Ethics is slightly taught, like even feminist ethics is taught at times in a very applied kind of field sense, and healthcare ethics, but the very idea of that what feminist philosophy has done in case of ethics, where they have actually brought dependency, vulnerability, our interdependent nature, and question that rational, autonomous, neoliberal individual, is something which is such a great intervention into the field of ethics and justice. So I guess we would still, need these kind of, we need to kind of lay out, if someone has like in a field like this where there are very less women, and we're happy there are more women now, but I guess this time would be there for a while.
So, I mean, if the way you're putting it, you're trying to say that certain kind of acknowledgement would not hurt, right? And especially if that acknowledgement is coming from a gender perspective, especially when we're
Yeah.
talking about the professional philosophy and the professional philosophical circle.
And
Okay.
also your point about how a philosopher looks, you had mentioned that
Yeah,
how,
yeah.
relate to the fact that I do a lot of other things apart from academia, per se, where I apply my academia. So I ran multiple initiatives in COVID, and one of which was around migrant workers when they got stuck, and so some of us got together to help navigate them go back. So my number, and after that, I still run a few initiatives. So my number has been on public platforms a lot of times. I would most of the time speak with people over WhatsApp. So just yesterday, somebody from that kind of time, whose number is not saved on my mobile, but I could see through previous chats, okay, I had helped that person go back home to one of the flights that we had arranged, and through Shramik trains and all of that. So he was part of that cohort. And he randomly, I don't even remember his name, but that person randomly texts me yesterday, and I'll speak it in Hindi and then I'll translate, कि कैसी DP लगाए हो madam? And what kind of DP have you put? And I was like, okay, there's a presumption that if someone is in the social sector or social work sector or this sector where maybe they might be doing something that you have thought it's a good deed, but that person cannot look like this. that person has to look a certain way. And it kind of ties in with what you said. If you are wearing a mascara or a liner, you might not be serious enough about your work. That sadly happens in almost all industries.
Yeah, I believe, I think that's something which we always talk to these people when we are interviewing them. That, like, how do you describe how does a philosopher looks like? Now that you are almost about to submit your PhD, and you also have some strong beliefs about how things should be and how things should not be. Like, do you think these qualifiers helps? Like sometimes, I mean, especially for a man, nothing and everything else because he's a man. But when we talk about other genders, right, do you think that there possibility of being taken seriously? Are we also that much conscious every time when we are overdoing anything, even if we think we are overdoing it? Sometimes it could be a tint of mascara to a hat which we are wearing, and largely every time when we're entering the public domain. Private domain is all right. When you are facing a class of 70, 110 students, and when you know that they have one image of how a philosopher looks like, how a philosopher talks. So, how do you respond to ideas like this?
Yeah, so I'll kind of begin with the fact that at times when we think that things should be like this and should not be like that, that also is a spectrum. That also changes. But even in case of men, also there is a certain idea that how an ideal man should represent himself. In my own personal space, and at times I would feel, oh, my father is not doing this, which should a father should be doing. But then that's an idea that I've formed, that this is the masculine image of a father, and father has to be like this, right? But then when you question your own gender position, then you also are more equipped to understand the position of the other end of the spectrum of the gender. And then there are a lot of them in between, right? There can be people who are very well versed with their subject, but their gender expression might be something different than you expect from someone who you think is from that gender category. So someone's gender expression, might be, you might feel, oh, that person looks like a man, but why that person insists that my pronouns are this and this and not something else, or why that person comes like this. So at times, I guess, at times we ourselves to not like to kind of just avoid certain questions or certain stares would, we might try to toe the line. We might want to just look a certain way when I go to my class. But remember what happened just a few days back, where I think it was in West Bengal. The case was from West Bengal, where a teacher's personal Instagram profile was hacked, and her pictures were kind of on some student's phone, and the father of the student is complaining, and the college has kind of fired the teacher. And that kind of, one is that what is your personal space? Do you at all have a personal space? Do you always have to carry a certain image? But otherwise also, can't we leave these decisions to the people concerned, that how they want to represent themselves, because that also is a very, very important part of your identity, and more so for people, say, from the LGBTQ community, right? Your expression of your gender, your performance of your gender becomes a very it's a radical tool at the end of the day. But I will also kind of say that I do understand when people want to toe the line, and I do understand when they want to represent a certain image in particular scenarios, because they might feel that they'll be, they will avoid certain stares, they'll avoid certain questions coming their way. But then the line is, where is your private space and where's your personal space when your even private space is being invaded, as happened in that teacher's case. So I think, yeah, now when I enter the work field, and what if, say, if I become a faculty again, I would, think, even today I thought what I should wear. Who would be the audience? I looked at your previous videos to see how people have represented themselves. So, that happens at times, how you want to toe the line. And we see the opposite in the corporate. You have to be like that. You have to be prim and proper, otherwise you won't be taken seriously, right? So I guess that happens in all the industry. But I guess these are very important questions to ask. These are very important questions to ask, especially with a profession like teaching.
Yeah. So, Priya, now that we are about to wrap up our series, I'll quickly ask you two, three couple of questions. Firstly, now that you are working in a particular field, you are also using your theoretical knowledge into other applied aspect of everyday life. Do you think that do you perceive any gender gap in philosophy? And if yes, what do you think? Could there be certain systemic changes which we should implement in the academia, in the courses, in the syllabus, in the outline, in the outlook, which you think can help in reducing the gender gap?
Yeah, so I would preface it by saying that I say I have not had the experience of doing an undergrad or master's in philosophy. So I only hear from others when they say that, and they come to our, now we also have an IIT and MA PhD combined course, but usually I used to speak to the other PhD colleagues, and they would tell me that they have never read about any, they never prescribed any readings by female professors or female, philosophers in certain areas of philosophy. So I think the need is also, so feminist philosophy has done a great job already. The idea is also how to look at the work of women philosophers who might not even identify as feminists, but who have done tremendous work in the different branches of philosophy, and to make this a cautious choice, because see what we are already doing with decolonizing academic discourse and that movement, right? We are already questioning the white streaming of curriculum. We're already bringing the scholars from global south, from Latin America, from different parts of Africa, even beyond South Africa. So we are thinking of. I was in this one. So I'm editing a volume. So we had a workshop for our contributing authors, and there one of the authors very nicely said that when we talk about South African, like African perspective, it's mostly from South Africa. So she's trying to talk about Zambia, like looking at Zambia, and from there now taking some other scholars, philosophers, anthropologists, and then trying to decolonize their ethics. So I think when we are doing so much effort, and you'll find decolonizing everywhere as a buzzword these days, right? So when we are taking so much effort in decolonizing, and when we are questioning the white streaming and everything, I think at the same time it will be too hypocritical of us to not question the gender domain at the end of the day, right? That comes with it. When we go out and maybe say, oh, global south is not represented, and then we come back and in our own space, we don't represent certain genders, we don't represent certain castes at times, we don't let them represent themselves. We feel that if they are doing only say vernacular language, if they're only trained, or maybe are only they're experts in, say, I'm only expert in ethics for now, but if they're experts say in particular part of philosophy which is in a certain language, because that literature is in that language, at times they are not seen as competent enough as opposed to their colleague who might be very well versed in English counterpart of similar theory or other theories, or theories from the West, right? So I think a very cautious choice, like we are doing with decolonizing academia, we have to also look at the post-colonial states like us and see what are the other other categories that we have left behind, who we would want to add. And there would be a lot, I'm sure there'll be a lot of feminist, like a lot of female professors who would deny the fact that there is any gender gap, or because they might not have felt it personally. That can happen. I have not faced any, say, I'm from a certain casting community, I have not faced discrimination. So I think there is, there's no discrimination. But then do I also get the right to say that therefore there should be no action to ameliorate or like to work out this? No, I think then we have to listen to the other voices. And that is what I think one has to do. Yeah.
So, Priya, I think this would be my second last question to you. I just want to know that since 2.5 years, we were trying to wrestle with pandemic, COVID, right? And then I think we also reached a stage where we did realize that it's stronger than us and it has to be complete submission, right? Which we did. And then later on, now we are trying to move on with our lives and all. Uh, During all this, when this entire phase was going on, do you think now, when you look at it in hindsight, do you think philosophy, its role, its functions, has it changed in any way now that we have survived a particular kind of pandemic? Or do you think for you philosophy still remains what it used to be at some point of time? How do you see
So
things?
that's a very great question, because I was reading somewhere that everyone wants to go back to normal, but do we see that normal, was that normal ever normal for certain kind of, for certain people? So maybe this is the time to contemplate and see, okay, where to move from here. And I would want to commend you particularly, Dr. Shukla, because you have done a lot of work in public philosophy. And I think this is the time. This is the time to get, because there is this, entire thing around philosophy that it is armchair in most of the times and disciplines and academic spaces, where like experience is brought into question, but the latest ongoing things are not at times, like taken head on. Not to say that nobody takes it. You are the one who take it, So I think you've done wonderful work to look at the contemporary things, to look at popular culture, and then talk about it. So I think pandemic for all of us, I think for all the disciplines, has been a great. I don't know if I have to use the word great with pandemic, but and also then use that it's again making rounds in China and other places. But I think it has been that time which has made all of us stop still and rethink, because it has made the iniquities of the world very clear. In the first wave, when some of us were like very okay with everything, oh, it's just 21 days, it's holiday period and all of that. At the same time, there were workers on the ground who had to walk to their homes, because for them, everything shutting down did not mean rest. It meant no money to pay their rent in cities like Delhi and Bombay and other cities, right? And they wanted to go back, but there was no way to do that. And they were living in cramped places. Social distancing meant what to them, right? Sanitizing, washing hands, so number of times. We have to face the reality, and I think pandemic gave us that reality check, and that was a very real reality check, and that is a reality check, I think, of to for everyone. Like, for example, if I give you the example of, say, anthropologists or ethnographers, they had to question the methodology. That do we still live in that time where we do this 10 months, and if we have not done 10 months, we are not a good ethnographer or whatever, because everything stopped, right? And then there are innovations in methodologies. You do innovations in disciplines, like you question certain things. Also, because that many times we are not able to, especially as women, we are not able to go out and say we be at some place for so long if you also have a family to look after. Otherwise, also there might be other reasons that you're not able to spend that kind of time. So we question our methodologies. I think same is the thing with philosophy. The very idea of the ethics of, say, vaccine or vaccine hoarding, or even giving vaccine to someone, or denying the vaccine. A lot of things, there were a lot of ethical questions which popped up. But I think the very basic questions about how we live our lives, the very ontological, questions of human being, I think they were like up there, out in front. Yesterday only I was in a seminar on decolonizing global health, and there one of the scholars was speaking about the fact that how Africa, so the COVID reached a little late in Africa, and then they were emulating the practices which were going on in other countries, distancing and all of that, hygiene. But then they realized that the situation that we have, right, that our context is different. And then they kind of, changed the methodologies and all of tackling the virus. I think the same with our discipline as well. The very idea, the very importance of context became important. And I think it takes back to the fact that how experience, context, vulnerability, dependency, these are very, very, very real things, and they're not going to leave us. And pandemic has given us that reminder.
Yeah, a reminder, and I think most importantly, I remember first lockdown, may everybody was like giving Instagram challenges and playing Ludo and whatnot. By the time 21 days were over and the lockdown was extended, I believe many people started having anxiety because they were like, what do I do of this much of time? Unfortunately, I have to think. Right? And that is something that's also where a lot of philosophers came into the public domain. And they said that, see, this, you don't need to be fearful of the thought that you have to think. That's something which you do on a very everyday basis, okay? Like someone interested in toning her body or his body, they go to gym. We flex this, right? So I
Yes.
think the fact that people were afraid to think because out of nowhere everything had stopped and they had time in their hands and they're like, what do I do? Like, this is so Victorian, but it's not, right? Like, so, so I mean,
Point about thinking you've picked up, no? Such a great point about thinking because that's what philosophers do, right? And then when
we
others
don't
are like,
have any field work, right? Like, this world is the field,
is
right?
the yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so Priya, I think this would be my last question to you. What would you like to say to people who are at your stage, who are about to submit, and they have this, they're trying to balance interdisciplinarity in their work? And secondly, what would you like to say to people who at some point of time are about to join higher education? They're about to get enrolled in PhD. So any takeaway for them?
Yeah, so I think I'll start with the second one first, and I'm sorry about this very zigzag light on my face. Yeah, that happens with the blind and the sun. So, so yeah, for the ones who are who might be getting into higher education right now and choosing what to do, no matter which field you come from, I think it is a great time because we have some things like say YouTube and other places where even our governments are putting the entire courses there with the best faculty for you to read. So, I was the other day, I was also telling to someone else that if you want to start with, I'll just take an example. If you say don't know anything about feminist theory, but you want to know, because feminism, anyways, is a buzzword and in whatever sense, but I'm talking about if academically you want to do something in gender and others, there are wonderful courses on YouTube from India. So NPTEL is government's project, and there is this one professor, Matangi Krishnamurthy, Dr. Krishnamurthy from IIT Madras. She has a course on feminism theories and concepts. It's wonderfully put together. You love the citations that she's given, and it will be a good entry point. And there's another professor from, this is for my sociology and anthropology folks. And for anyone interested in theory, there's another professor, I think she recently retired. Her name is Professor Maitri Chaudhary from JNU. She has wonderful courses on theory, sociology, feminist theory, and everything. So I think, and I would want to give a lot of appreciation to the education department, and otherwise also, we would always go back to the maybe 5 Oxford lectures on this, Yale lectures on this. We should do. Everyone should do. But I was so happy to find these very rooted lectures in the sense and in the tongue that we understand. So I think for the ones who are just starting, I think, now, I think I won't say like you will have your own struggle. I won't say that ours was a more difficult time, but even then there was Google when I was doing it, but I was not aware when I was from a small place and I never knew a lot of things. But now I guess, that you have some things like YouTube, like courses which are already there, free courses that you can at least get yourself acquainted with. And then government also does this e-Pathshala. So you go on e-Pathshala, you'll at least find some reference point to begin with. So it is for the ones who are just starting, that don't worry, whichever field you are in, you will find some reference there. And now I'll come to the first part, that if you feel you're in the wrong field, because either your parents pushed you, or your teachers pushed you, or you yourself were not sure, right? Don't worry, that you can always change. You can always find that one path for yourself which will be little bit more satisfactory. See, challenges will always be there. I came from natural sciences to social sciences, and I felt that, oh my god, I've gone from here to here. I could not make sense of anything. And that's when I realized it's such a misnomer that, oh, you've STEM, so you're I don't know where and whatever. It's a misnomer. It's nothing like that. So I think if you want to take that leap, if you want to do that, like I knew I wanted to do that, and I acted smartly after my undergrad and after my school. My father got me enrolled into an engineering college. I say father particularly because my mother was not very much in that favor, but I said I won't go there. I'll do something and I researched. I did not even know how to use Google. I took Oxford Dictionary and I researched different, words which I found in university's prospectus. And then I did. And slowly, I moved from one university to another, made a lot of mistakes, met some wonderful teachers. So keep an eye out for that one particular mentor or teacher who you think, who you can gel with, who you can easily approach. I really wish that all the teachers were like that, that who were approachable. So I think you don't kind of, just don't think that this is an end and you can't do much. I know, and I think I'll acknowledge one thing, Dr. Shukla, while parting, that I think I had the might not have had this privilege because they had to fend for their families immediately. So they had to do those professional courses immediately after school, or they had to do those diploma courses, those other professional courses, even if they didn't like them, because they had to fend for their families. I think there I speak from a position of privilege, that I could make, because I think I was in that position. No matter, I thought my family is not supporting my decisions, but they were supporting me throughout till 11th. After that, I started getting stipend and started paying my own fee, right? So I think I also speak from a position of privilege, that not everyone, you might not always have this option to pick and choose what you really want to do. Has a lot of things up. So just, little mindful what you see. That's why I refer these government resources for you. But
No.
yeah, you can always, we'll put some my email ID somewhere in description, so just write to me.
Yeah. Actually, thank you so much, Priya. That's what I wanted to say to everyone, that if you actually, once the video would be uploaded, after her bio, all her publications, as well as the resources which she has mentioned, we'll keep it in the bio sketch so that you can always go back to these resources, have a look at it, and of course, her email address as well, so that if at some point of time you want to reach out to her for any collaboration, you should be free to do that as well. So, Priya, thank you so much for taking out time and doing this interview or dialogue with philosophers with us. It has been long due, actually. I'm glad that we are wrapping up this particular year by this particular collaboration which we have had. And thank you so much. Thank you so much again.